My mic should be okay, so let's take this off. Welcome everybody. It's a pretty full room, and I'm actually positively surprised that hopefully most of you recognize, and that's one of the main themes of this talk, that FHIR doesn't equate REST. That's one of the key things. I am trying to present a lot of FHIR training courses, and then you have these people that come into the room and go like, why you're talking about FHIR messaging and FHIR documents? I mean, FHIR is REST and it's cool, API. But then I talked to, just before we started here, with Michael Johansson here in the corner from Medcom, usually a health IT organization in Denmark, and they're moving away from messaging to REST and FHIR documents in a more nice mixture between the two. There are lots of use cases where REST is not the most appropriate way of exchanging data. So you should always consider, is one of those other exchange mechanisms, because we actually have a couple of them in FHIR, is one of the other exchange mechanisms actually more appropriate than? So we have REST, certainly we have REST. 95% plus of implementations of FHIR are based on REST. But FHIR does not equate REST, right? You can do FHIR documents if you want, using the lessons learned from the older CDA specification, the clinical document architecture. There are use cases where that's most appropriate. And messages, by far the oldest here as an option. This dates back to the 1960s when they started working with that exchange mechanisms. It's pretty reliable, and there are some use cases where this is still the best exchange mechanism to use. Plus, obviously, in services, you can use FHIR resources as payloads, but well, with services, you can do anything you want. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. The key thing in FHIR, obviously, is that regardless of what the exchange paradigm is, one of the four we just saw, the content is the same. We're talking about the same resources, the same profiles, the same value sets. So if we have a lab system that produces a lab result and they share that in the form of a message, new lab result, here's a bucket of information about that lab result, which is a fairly typical use case for messaging. And maybe you store that in a FHIR repository, you yank the FHIR resources out of there. Got to be careful when you do that, but some circumstances you can. You store them. Maybe you manipulate them using REST. REST is more about individual resources and manipulating them. And then you create a FHIR document that contains, let's say, a summary style document over something that has happened to the patient, a discharge note of sorts, or a clinical summary. These are typical examples of, I don't want to share all of the data that I created in my workflow. I want to share a subset of data with mostly another organization, and I need to have a textual version that is authenticated by the sender. That's more like a document. But still, all of it is based on the same set of resources and profiles. And that's one of the key wins that we have in FHIR, because in older standards, these models in documents would be different models than the models in messages would be different than this. So we already have that. So when do you use REST? Well, certainly, if you want low coupling, small lightweight exchanges, client-driven client-server orchestration. So the client determines what happens here. If the client says delete this or update that, given that they have the authentication and authorization to do that, obviously, the server has to do it. Okay, so the client is in the driver's seat. But yes, all these new use cases that we don't cover in older HL7 standards, certainly FHIR, well-suited, mobile apps, PHRs, registries, REST is the way to go. However, there's more than that, right? Documents. If you have FHIR documents, then documents, the focus is on two things. Persistence. I want to archive this document for a very long time. I actually don't know whether my discharge letter is going to be read by my colleague tomorrow or by a GP 30 years from now. I have no clue. And a medical summary document can actually be relevant that long. So persistence of a story, the whole story of this patient around the discharge. It's not a fragment of information. Here's a lab result. No, it's a whole story that's contained in that document. Okay, so persistence and narrative, human readability. So I may not actually be able to express all of the data that I want to express in a document in a computable version. But in FHIR documents, it's mandatory to have text, which means as a receiver, even if I don't understand the underlying coded and structured information, I can still display the text and I will have human-to-human interoperability. Sounds like a good idea to me, because after all, that's what we're trying to achieve. There is this small footnote of human languages that tend to differ, okay? But nowadays with Google Translate and AI agents, whatever, okay? Obviously, the content of a document consists of multiple FHIR resources because it's an overall story that covers a lot of ground, so to speak. Now, text versus coding is a classic dilemma, okay? What's the optimal hybrid mixture? And people with a clinical background, they love text. It's ultimately flexible. I can express everything I want. And yes, it has structure. You may not be able to recognize that, okay? Except perhaps the German-speaking gentleman that I saw sitting here in the front. This is a code that indicates, it's a German clinical note, that basically indicates that this is the family history. And here we have notation that this apparently medication list, 100, which is 1 for breakfast, 0 for lunch, and 0 for dinner. So it does have structure. And the idea was, when they started thinking about documents in the HL7 community, to enrich this with structured data. Because programmers love this equivalent, right? Oh, I'm going to give you drop-down lists. You have to choose a code, a diagnosis code, because I can do billing and workflow control and all their fancy stuff with codes. And then you put this screen in front of a clinical person and they go like, yeah. Okay. And they say, where's my text field? Because you cannot code and structure everything. So what do you do as a programmer? Okay, hesitantly, you put a text field there. How then subsequently do clinical users use that user interface? They put everything in the text, right? Wherever I ask that rhetorical question, you see everybody in the audience going like, yes. So that's just to make you feel and realize that element of tension again between the necessity to have a certain level of structure and the flexibility of text. So in FHIR documents, you're trying to have the best of both worlds. A certain level of computable expression and a textual expression as well. Okay, so what's a document then in FHIR? How is it modeled? Well, it's a bundle because a FHIR document is a set of multiple resources, so it's modeled as a bundle. And the bundle is of a particular type. The type is document. So that indicates that, this is for persistence. Okay, needs to persist it as is, mostly stored as a blob in the database because you're not supposed to modify it ever. We see that the bundle has a composition, and the composition is more or less the document header. This contains the metadata, if you want, of the document. Who's the author, who's the patient, and what textual sections are contained in that particular document. Right, so plus other resources that express, those are the computable expressions, if you want, of information that's already present in the text sections. So let's look at this. This is an example. This is Adam Everyman, which is the patient shown here near the top, patient Adam Everyman. And he goes to his practitioner, and let's assume that we use some RESTful exchange to create this bucket load of FHIR resources. This is, in effect, the clinical record for this patient. Now let's create a document for the follow-up encounter. I want to create a discharge letter, a document for this encounter. Obviously, I'm not going to recreate these FHIR resources. They already exist in my FHIR-based database. So I'm just going to yank those out of my database and use them to compose basically a document. Hence, the name of this one, the composition. I'm composing a document with a sender and receiver and other metadata, which is here. And I have sections. These are repeating blocks within this composition resource that each have the textual, the narrative, and depending on the implementation guide and your conformance rules and that sort of stuff, a computable expression of that same information as well. So it's a dual nature. It's textual on one hand, and on the other hand, we have computable expressions in the form of FHIR resources. And mostly nowadays, we first have the computable resources and then we generate the text from those resources. That's the usual way that people create documents nowadays. Actually, the American College of Physicians actually says, well, all that structured data capture stuff that you IT guys are forcing us to do, okay, we should minimize that as much as possible. Are we as IT persons adhering to that? Mostly not, right? But yeah, so there's a very strong feeling. This is a position statement, official position statement from 2015, so it's a while ago, that no, it's only sufficient natural language processing. They're gambling on that effectively. So the big question is, well, if you already have this somehow, then you have it in your database, let's say it's 2 integers, and then you have to create a section in my document, a FHIR document. Well, then I have these 2, which are the references to the observation resources, but I don't have text. It's mandatory in a document. You go like, okay, so some programmer has to write something to turn it into a nice looking table or in a nice sentence like blood pressure 120/80. Human interoperability, check. And it actually tells me, generated, that this text is generated based on the underlying structured data. But more interesting enough is the other way around. We have patient with onset of asthma in his teens. In our database, which is just a text field, we try to turn that into a section in my FHIR document, and then I have text. But everybody recognizes, it would be nice if at least that word asthma, if that would be enriched somehow with a SNOMED CT code, so that our software processors actually can also deal with that. Otherwise, to them, it's just a snippet of text, which doesn't mean anything. So we won't like to have an entry, and the entry contains the computable version, if you want, of what's in the text. And here we have a reference to the observation that contains the SNOMED code for asthma. But how do you do that? Well, it depends on the context. Sometimes it's human coders that sit somewhere in the basement of the hospital and they go over the text and they have to find out the code, right? Or it's natural language parsing. And years ago, I think it's 10 years ago, I was at a trade show and they had this natural language parsing, which was still very new at that point in time. And as soon as you type the word asthma, it would go like, ha, 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 ha. Pop-up screen. There are 27 asthmas in SNOMED. Which one is it? And you had to pick one. But the system was already smart enough that when you're writing a discharge letter and more above in your discharge letter, you already had the discharge medications, then it would go like, oh, wait a second, you're typing asthma, there are 27 asthmas, but that medication over there is only prescribed for 3 types of asthma, so I'm giving you the 3 most likely ones near the top of the 27. And if you were a trained clinician, then basically you would barely see the pop-up and it was gone again. Okay, because they were so trained to deal with that. That's one way of doing it. And you go like, oh, fully automated natural language processing. Do you really want to use that in clinical practice? For research, it's probably okay right now in English. Don't try this in any other language, right? Because there is not enough information for these models to be trained in the other languages at this point in time. But we'll probably get there to, in some automated way with a very high level of reliability, it may take another 20 years, I don't know, maybe much faster than that, to go with good quality natural language parsing to derive our computable structures. That will totally change the layout of our GUIs, right? If we get to that stage. Now, documents are very easy to display. And this is one of the reasons why something like the European Union, which has to deal with a lot of different healthcare systems and still exchange data, they love documents. Because however stupid or intelligent your receiving software application is, you can always display text. So I was at a training course, I think 5 years ago in Greece. I shall not mention the country. And then they told me basically in the coffee break, not during the session, I was talking about all sorts of interoperability standards and great things you could do with it. And they went like, well, you know, 25% of Greek physicians have access to a PC. And I went like, okay, so you mean 75% is still working exclusively on paper? Yes. Okay, this is 5 years ago, situation may have changed. But you feel that as the EU, where you're dealing with highly sophisticated countries that have lots of health IT infrastructure and other countries that have absolutely none or relatively none, then you need some sort of common denominator. And text is obviously something that works everywhere. So text in that sense is also attractive. Let's move on to messaging. Okay, because I was going to present you the alternatives to REST, which are documents and messaging. Documents, persistence, narrative as the key characteristics. Messaging is the oldest one. Okay, came out of the defense industry, end 1950s, 1960s, they already started with messaging. Store and forward architecture, just like email, it may actually go over multiple hops that actually do their own processing on the message. It's a worst case assumption. I'm not going to assume that you as a receiver have ever heard about this patient before. Which means that each and every time when I send you one of those messages, I will have to inform you again of the full patient demographics, of the allergies. So these messages tend to be relatively rich, very elaborate in detail. But it's server-driven orchestration. So I'm sending this bucket load of information to the server, and the server goes, oh, thank you. But this is a male patient. Chuck the whole message. I'm the gynecology department. I don't care about males. Nowadays you have to, but that's a different thing, right? Right, so it's up to the server to determine that, oh, I see that this patient has moved from bed A to bed B. I understand that, and I'm going to ignore the rest of the whole message, however rich it is. Okay, server-driven orchestration. So that's a real different way of thinking than REST, which is client-driven orchestration. And messaging is trigger event-based. And these trigger events are business events. Patient Smith has been admitted. But that means that in my system, I have all the details of this admit and of the patient, and nobody else in my hospital knows anything about this patient. So the burden is upon me to start informing all these other parties, kind of a broadcast, Patient Smith has been admitted. So you can create your own copy of that information in your own database. Whereas REST is mostly, I'm going to fetch stuff. Who is in the hospital right now? Ping, pong, right? That's more of a query response type of mechanism. So these trigger events are key to these message exchanges, because for each trigger, new lab result, new patient admit, you need a different set of data items to describe the details of that event. So trigger event based, and actually these triggers are defined within the specification itself, because each trigger, as I said, has an associated data structure. And in messaging, it's always peer-to-peer, okay? And there's always some form of acknowledgement. And the acknowledgement can be very simple, like, yeah, I've understood, next message, reliable messaging if you want. But it could also be an acknowledgement that's related to the contents of your message. I want to do this pregnancy test for this male person. Then maybe the lab system is going to go, I can do that, it's good for revenue, but I more or less already know the outcome of the particular observation. Okay, so no, I'm not going to do that. I'm following some business rules. No, I'm going to do that because males don't get pregnant, at least as of today. It's a nice intuitive example. Let's see how many clinical persons there are in this room. Would you actually do a pregnancy test? Would you order that for a male person? I see one nodding head, a few nodding heads. Yes. I was doing this training course, and then a German professor in the back of the room with white coat and everything, he was going, well, you know, Herr Spronk, we actually do that. Okay, you always learn something, right? Because if you, it's not called a pregnancy test, but if you test for the same hormone in males, then it's actually an indication for particular forms of testicular cancer. So it's always a problem with nice intuitive examples. Yeah, there's always nice little details. But back to version messaging, it's always a message with a response, and the transport is not predefined. If you want, you can use HTTP, but you don't have to. You can use whatever you want. Smoke signals. Doesn't have a very good bandwidth, but you can do it. So if we look at the message structure for messages, how does it look like in FHIR? Well, it's a bundle again. But the bundle in this case is of type message. Messages have a message header to identify the sender and the receiver, okay, and to identify the trigger event. What's the business event that I am documenting? Plus, the message header has, if this is, let's say, new patient admitted, then we have a focus reference to the patient that has been newly admitted. Okay, this is something that if you have version 2 background, then we didn't have this in version 2, but that's a specific new feature that new patient admitted, you have a focus to the thing that is the focus of my trigger event. But this contains all the rich details related to the trigger event. Okay, back. Right, so the standard itself defines trigger events, but mostly that's an implementation guide. So whatever implementation guide you have, so you are going to create a Danish implementation guide for Danish FHIR messages, and you will have Danish business trigger events in there, because they may very well be different. So the FHIR standard is actually, this is a table from STU3, and in R4, the table is empty. So basically what they're saying is, this is not for us internationally to define, this is for you to define at the project level. And some people are tempted and go like, well, I have these ADT events in HR7 version 2, and obviously you can refer to the codes that we have been using in version 2 all of those years. You can use the same codes here if you want to. Now, in general, when we talk about messages, then most of these messages are messages of notification. There are 3 kinds of messages. Something happened in my system and I'm doing kind of a broadcast. Smith has been admitted, right? And actually, it's idempotent. I can send it again. Smith has been admitted, and at most you will update your database twice, but that doesn't really do any harm. Then we have currency, message of currency. Give me information about something using a message. Now in the old HR7 version 2 space, this is actually not that commonly used. Okay, this is probably 90% of all exchanges traditionally with messaging. Message of currency and message of consequence. I'm sending an order to the receiver and the receiver is supposed to do something. Please do this lab test for this maybe pregnant male. And then you get a response that says, yeah or no, I'm not going to do this or whatever. Okay, so these are the 3 kinds of message exchanges. Now, what if you then want to send a query, this message of currency, because maybe you're used to a RESTful FHIR and then you go like, oh, I'll just build a search URL and I'll execute that over REST. But here you get the very same parameters, but now they are included in a parameters resource, and the parameters resource is the focus of the query message. So you can use the very same query parameters that you will be using in a RESTful exchange. Now let's go back to my example of Adam Everyman. Let's create a message for the prescription. Because the story is that he first had amoxicillin, but turned out to be allergic to it, allergy intolerance penicillin. So now we're stopping the old medication and starting erythromycin. Okay, so I want to send a prescription for this one to the local community pharmacy around the corner. so that the patient can pick it up. Okay. So I create an instance, which is a bundle, which is the outermost box. And the bundle has a trigger event, new prescription, from Dr. Hippocrates, the prescribing physician, to local town pharmacy. The focus of the new prescription is the resource that contains the details of the new prescription. And then, because I'm assuming that the receiver has never heard from me, I'm going to include the patient, the encounter, the condition, which is the ear infection. That's the reason why we're prescribing erythromycin, and the allergy intolerance. Kind of nice to notify the pharmacy that this patient is allergic to penicillin. And whether the pharmacy chooses to ignore that or not would be rather strange, but that's again, server side is ultimately up to them. So when do you want to use messaging? It's always request response. Okay. If you have workflow control or complexity that goes beyond CRUD, because essentially REST is CRUDs. Now, the FHIR REST API has been tweaked somewhat because we have operations, and operations are also server-side. So what they're doing is basically trying to get a bit of both worlds, right? By nature, messaging is always server-side orchestration. But asynchronous indirect exchanges, still something, need to communicate about clusters of resources, also messaging. I found it interesting that the NHS, the English NHS, they were doing some analysis of the traffic on their national secure backbone. And they saw, I don't know what the exact time was, around 8:15 or something, they saw this huge blip in exchanges of FHIR resources. Lots of ping-ponging, thousands and thousands, and they were going like, what's that? Because there was overloading their network at that point in time. And they found out this was the shift change. This is when the new nurses and doctors' assistants came in the morning, and they started prefetching all the data for all the patients that would had an appointment that day. So they saw suddenly a huge spike, basically, in exchanges of FHIR resources. And I went like, okay, so REST is way too chatty to get hold of a record, ping pong, ping pong, ping pong, ping pong, 10,000 times, right? To exchange a message, one response. Okay, now obviously using operations and other fancy mechanisms, you couldn't get around with that. But it shows you that sometimes you may have, as in their case, volumetric reasons for choosing maybe something that's not REST. Services, well, you can do whatever you want. So with services, you can mimic CRUD, you can mimic messages, you can mimic documents if you really want to do that. And then there is a leftover category, and that's basically what we know as operations in FHIR. Okay, so services, you should probably equate that to the operations paradigm that we also have in the FHIR space. Now, where is this in the specification? Well, if you go to the front page of the spec, on the right-hand side, there is the exchange module, and that talks about REST documents, messaging, services, and this is not an exchange paradigm, but some guidance on how you persist FHIR resources. But it's not about exchange, that's about storage. Okay, but this is where you find the various exchange paradigms and the relationships between them. So FHIR does not equate REST. We actually have 4 exchange mechanisms. So that's my kind of take-home message, if you want, that if you are designing an exchange somewhere, to also keep these other ways of exchanging stuff in mind, because you may very well end up with some sort of mixture between FHIR documents, FHIR RESTful FHIR, and FHIR messages. Quite often you're not totally free to choose. For example, I use Denmark as an example. Denmark is traditionally just like the Netherlands. We're a messaging country, lots of messages, very early adoption, lots of message being exchanged. And that may very well lead to that if you have the choice, it's easier to then use FHIR messages than to go to RESTful exchanges for some of your exchanges. But people who go like, well, it needs to be 100% FHIR messages, you're probably also wrong. Okay, it's not going to be 100% messages, 100% documents, or 100% REST. It's going to be a mixture between all of that. Generally, you can share the resources and the profiles between those various ways of exchange. There are a few things that are rather tricky when you do this, when you get information out of a document and then use it in a RESTful environment or out of a message. There are some very relevant footnotes there, but generally you can exchange data between the various paradigms. All right, so that's me. Should you wish to follow up on this particular topic? There are some related talks here. International Patient Summary is an example of a very successful FHIR document implementation guide used at the international level. IPS, bidirectional conversion of CCDA, so that's the CDA document to FHIR document and vice versa. And on Friday, I will have a talk myself on transforming version 2 to FHIR, going from messaging to a RESTful environment. So those are kind of suggestions as to follow-up presentations during these DevDays. Now let me see whether we have any questions in our Q&A.
Thank you, Rene.
When you use messaging in particular for queries in a request response manner, how do you specify where to send the response to?
Where does the response go to if you send a query message? In HL7 version 2 space, I would answer with the sender of the query is the party that we respond to. But in HL7 version 3, I know that we allowed you to specify a different receiver of the response. So I'm fully expecting that to also be supported in FHIR. But I don't know for sure off the top of my head, because is this in the 80% use case? This may very well be an exotic use case where they decided, well, if you want the response to go somewhere else, use an extension.
I have to map the sender ID to the endpoint. I have to map the sender ID to the endpoint URL or other physical address. How do I do this?
That's a good one, but I think that's a generic problem when we talk about messaging in general. So that's no different from a query response than it is for messaging in general. But I don't know the perfect answer to that. I fully agree that this needs to happen.
Is there any mechanism for digital signatures and encryption of the message?
Yes. Let's put it this way. FHIR has the mechanism for basically all of the FHIR resources for them to be signed if you want to. So this applies to messaging just like any other FHIR resource.
So you can sign the bundle basically, or
you can sign the bundle, yes. Which is something you may or may not wish to do. Quite a lot of people are tempted to sign sometimes part of bundles or bundles as a whole, but there is a lot of drawbacks to that. But then I'm veering quite off topic here. But in general, yes, you can sign whatever you want in FHIR.
And the signature is standardized. I mean, there's one type of signature.
I don't know. Is there one type of signature? No, you can have your own signature method if you want to. So this is again up to an implementation guide to decide what you have to use in a particular project or context.
Okay.
It's a general answer, but it's the best I can give you right now. So.
You put in your slide every time that messaging is perfect for request response. Is used for is always used with request response, but in our situation, that's not what we see, because we often have a broker between the sender of the messages and multiple receivers of that one message.
Messaging is peer-to-peer by nature. So if you go from A to a broker, and then from a broker to another party, what you see is that you send to the broker and the broker sends an acknowledgement I have received. So that's your request response mechanism.
Yes.
And then you have the same game between the message broker. It's only different if you send this order, let's say for the pregnant male to the server, to a lab system. then it's different. And the message needs to go all the way to the destination before we can route back
Yeah,
the
that's
answer
another
to
case,
the original party.
but most cases in practice, we don't see response messages. We just fire and forget.
Well, fire and forget is rarely a good idea unless you have a
But
reliable
we fire it
infrastructure.
on the, we put our messages on a quality bus, a bus that has guarantees.
Yeah, if you have a reliable transport, like a reliable messaging bus, then obviously you don't need certain types of acknowledgement that we have seen here. I fully agree with you there.
Okay, I think we have a question back here, right?
Yeah, thanks. I had trouble hearing some of the questions, so I hope that I'm not asking the same thing that's already been asked. But my question is about kind of alternatives to messaging. I work in the US, both in public health and clinical informatics research. And in the US public health system, we have lots of examples of events which trigger an information transfer between organizations, maybe between healthcare providers and our state public health agencies, sometimes between state public health agencies and our federal public health agency. And so as we've worked to look for different ways of incorporating FHIR, particularly on the government side, one of the problems that we come up with is that in the traditional messaging world, real world events, you mentioned when a patient gets admitted, but other kinds of real world events, like when a patient is identified as having a communicable disease of some kind, or a particular lab report comes back. Those kinds of events set in place a whole bunch of activities that lead to a transfer of information across organizations. And in theory, there are patterns like subscriptions that you could use to trigger an event when something happens in a source information system. But in practice, we haven't found those to either be implemented very commonly, and we haven't found organizations that are that anxious to kind of store a whole bunch of subscriptions because some other organization wants to be notified about when data changes. So I'm sorry, there's a lot of setup for this question, but we keep coming back to this idea of wanting to capture external events by I'm sorry, not capture, but we keep coming back to this idea of wanting to signal that an event has occurred by sending a message. And I was intrigued that you started off by saying that the Netherlands and Denmark are message oriented. And I think I could say that the US, in our public health systems anyway, are also message oriented. So I'm curious, is there another pattern that I'm missing, or is it okay for us to sort of stay in that messaging world?
I would venture a guess that this is probably a good fit with some new concepts that are being discussed at this DevDays, which is the notified pool, which basically means you get a notification of the business event, granting you the right to subsequently retrieve additional data about that event from the source of the event. Okay, so then you're more talking about this is notification of an event plus the authorization to pool additional details. If you have a message, then you are notifying about the event, plus you as a sender determine what you're going to include. And that I can see that a lot of senders feel that they are in much more control when they do that. Because if I only send you the event, Smith has been admitted, and then you are allowed to fetch all sorts of data from my system, I have no clue what you're doing. I have no clue when you're doing it. So that opens up a whole security issue that you will then have to deal with. That can probably be dealt with nowadays. We have the technology in place, but I can see that intuitively people are hesitant to switch from a messaging environment, I push to you, to subscriptions or even REST, fetch it for me, or a notified pool. Those all feel more risky probably to people that are used to pushing messages. But notified pool, I think there is there's not a bird of a feather on it, but it will certainly be discussed here as well.
Okay, there's a couple questions online. The first is, Why is the document mode outside of REST? It seems solely like a way to bundle context together that could be then exchanged via REST API calls or other means.
A good question. Documents can be exchanged using all sorts of methods, obviously. And one of the key ways of exchanging documents is indeed via REST, which basically means that, here, dear server, here's a document, go store that as a blob. And because you're not supposed to break a document apart into whatever resources are in the bundle, you're supposed to archive it as is. So yes, you can use, and it is used, the REST as a mechanism to transfer a document from A to B. But so do smoke signals, okay? So it's not predefined in the FHIR specification that thou shalt transport FHIR documents using RESTful FHIR. You could use another mechanism if you wanted to. I could embed a FHIR document in a FHIR message and send it to you. I'm not tempted to do that, but I could.
And another question, is a composition resource only used for a bundle with the type quote unquote document, or can I also use it for other bundle types?
I would have to think. I would say that composition was really meant to be used for documents only. But a composition can also exist in a RESTful server outside of a document bundle. But you would have to look at whoever asked the question that please look at the composition page, because it will detail in the FHIR spec, because it will detail what those circumstances are. But the main reason for the composition is the fact that is kind of the metadata in a document bundle. That's why it exists. There are a few edge use cases where it's used outside of a bundle, but I won't get into that here.
Okay, any more questions from the room?
Hi. So a message bundle will typically have all these resources that are referentially pointing at each other by an identifier, right? Is there any assumption or guidelines for understanding if these identifiers represent something that can be retrieved later canonically by those identifiers, or should they be treated as ephemeral?
That is an interesting one. You have the same challenge when you receive resources in a document as in a message. Are those URLs, the logical identifiers, are those something I can follow up on and get a fresh copy of a resource, or that sort of thing? I think that's on an implementation basis, or perhaps on an implementation guide, to decide whether you're going to have URLs that actually still work, or whether you're going to have nonsensical URNs in there, which is what people use in practice. Personally, I'm of the opinion that if you communicate a URL, then you better make sure that that URL still works 100 years from now. And I'm not kidding. There are certain categories of data, at least in the European Union, related to DNA and that sort of stuff, that still have to work 100 years from now. By then, FHIR will be gone. Okay, so how do you make sure that your URLs are still going to work 100 years from now? So that indeed is a problem. Let's take a horizon that's a bit closer, like 10 years. How are you going to make sure that your URLs still work 10 years from now? That's a challenge of its own. So.
Anyone else?
So my question is also related to what was asked earlier. So if you have a bundle that is generated from auto-generated from all these components, is the ID meant to change if the content does not change? So if you're generating a bundle twice, a document twice, the ID is auto-generated during the process. Should it always remain the same?
Well, the ID of the bundle as a whole will certainly change because you're creating a new document. But the identifier of the resources that are contained in the bundle, I would not change them.
Okay.
So you actually incorporate a different version of a FHIR resource in the second document, but it will still have the same versionless URL for, let's say, an observation. Because in the ideal world, what you want is that the receiver could, tomorrow or 10 years from now, look at the document and go like, oh, I see an interesting elegy. Let's follow up on that. Although it's 30 years ago. Hey, URLs still work, right? Okay, so you grab it out of the message or the document and you go to the original server, assuming you can still find that endpoint and everything, right? And get hold of the details for the elegy. So yes, in an ideal world, you want those URLs to say the same all over the map. But that's not how it works in practice, but that's the ideal world.
Thank you.
All right,
we're
we're
up.
actually already over time, so
Please,
thanks everybody.
Rene. Oh,
Well,
thank you very
can
much,
say-
Rene.
All right, thank you. All right, enjoy the remainder of DevDays, which is only just begun, so have fun.